According to God's grace that was given to me, I have laid a foundation as a skilled master builder, and another builds on it. But each one is to be careful how he builds on it, for no one can lay any foundation other than what has been laid down. That foundation is Jesus Christ. If anyone builds on the foundation with gold, silver, costly stones, wood, hay, or straw, each one's work will become obvious, for the day will disclose it, because it will be revealed by fire. The fire will test the quality of each one's work. If anyone's work that he has built survives, he will receive a reward. If anyone's work is burned up, he will experience loss. But he himself will be saved, but only as through fire. Don't you yourselves know that you are God's temple, and that the Spirit of God lives in you? If anyone destroys God's temple, God will destroy him. For God's temple is holy, and that is what you are. This is God's word for us today.
All right. Morning, church. Excellent. As you know, we are in the midst of the series in the Gospel of Mark, starting last Easter and working our way up to this coming Easter. And in this part of Mark where we've been, actually the rest of the chapter, or the rest of the book, is all the last week of Christ's life, the last week that Jesus was alive on earth, obviously before his crucifixion and resurrection, but all leading up to that. And we've got our way about the middle of the week. And if you remember last week where Jesus was interacting with the scribes and the Pharisees, and we'll see more of that to come. But this week, we're gonna take a step out. If you remember, a few weeks ago, actually what would have been Palm Sunday in the calendar of the final week, that the week of the triumphal entry of Jesus coming into Jerusalem. And that starts that whole week, even in our calendar, of course, starts with the Holy Week, starting with Palm Sunday and running through Easter Sunday, Resurrection Sunday. All of that takes place in 1 week, and a lot of it takes place in the temple. And if you remember, John gave a brief introduction on just the theology of temples. And we looked at that even, the last time I was up here a couple of weeks ago, we looked at temples. Well, we're gonna pull that thread a little farther this morning. You know how they say, if you see a thread, don't pull it because you'll just keep pulling it. Well, we're gonna pull that thread today. We're gonna step out of Mark, but we're gonna take the opportunity that of so much happening in and around the temple, the next several chapters of Mark. We're gonna pull that thread. We're gonna explore in a little more detail kind of the history and the theology of temples and just how that plays into throughout the scriptures. Maybe mixing my metaphor of pulling a thread, we're going to follow that thread as it goes out through the whole scriptures. So if you remember, John gave this illustration about the garden, starting back in Genesis. And he said a simple definition of a temple, of any temple, is a place to meet God. It's a place where we as humans can meet with God. And in a lot of senses, even though it wasn't built by humans, the garden, the original creation, was a temple. And this is how John illustrated it with Eden, and in the midst of Eden was the garden, and that's where Adam and Eve could commune with God. It was a place to meet with God. I think the way Genesis references it is that they could walk with God in the cool of the evening. And there was just that idea of his creation there, and Adam and Eve there, and a special communion amongst them. Now, how that worked, your guess is as good as mine. in the sense of how God dwelt and walked in the garden and how Adam and Eve communicated and walked. But there's an intimacy, there's a dwelling of him in the garden. Of course, that's before Genesis 3. That's before the fall. That's before sin enters and death enters and Adam and Eve are expelled from the garden. And then all things change after that. And for a long period of time, God did not have a dwelling place on earth in the sense where he dwelt among his people. He would visit his people. He would appear to his people in dreams. You know, there's the stories throughout Genesis and the beginning of Exodus of God talking to his people and communicating, but it was always a stepping in, communicating something, and then stepping back. There wasn't a particular place that was considered the dwelling place of God until the tabernacle. Now, the tabernacle, familiar with the book of Exodus. Everybody knows the story of Exodus. We've all seen the movie. Thank you. Yeah, we've all seen the movie. You know, Moses in Egypt and you know, getting into trouble and fleeing Egypt and then coming back with the commission from God and the whole leading the people out in the Red Sea and Passover and all of that. But the interesting thing is, that's all of that whole story that we associate so much with Exodus is really the first 25 chapters of the book of Exodus. And after the actual Exodus, after the people leave and pass through the Red Sea and all that climax there's 15 more chapters in the book of Exodus. And the majority of that is all about the tabernacle. How to build the tabernacle, when to build the tabernacle, and all that. And basically, the tabernacle was to be a dwelling place for God. And once it was finally built, it looked like this. Now, it's temporary. They're nomadic, so it's portable. But for 15 chapters, it's all about this tabernacle. And I love this picture of it because it gives a nice scale. You can see how it was made from curtains and fabric and all that, so nothing's permanent. But then all around it, you see all the other tents around it. So for all the years that the Jews wandered around the wilderness, as in their nomadic lifestyle, they would take the tabernacle with them, and they would set up the tabernacle in the center of their group, and then all the tribes would put their tents around it. And that's such a great illustration because really, in a sense, tabernacle is just a fancy word for tent. So in a very literal sense, God is pitching his tent amongst all the tents of the people. And the detail in Exodus on what this was to look like can sometimes become, well, let's just say when you're reading Exodus, the first part of it, there's a lot more action than the second part of it. Because those five chapters that describe the furniture that go into this thing, the lampstands and the curtains and the tables. There's chapters on the materials, what it's made out of. There's gold and silver and wood and softer materials like leather and the curtains. There's details about the colors. This thing is supposed to be red, and this thing is blue, and this other thing over here is gold, and this other thing is purple. And there's details even about the clothing, right down to the details of the elaborate clothing that the garments that the priests would wear. And then there's a little parenthetical story about Aaron building this golden calf. We won't get into that. And then another 4 or 5 chapters all about how they built the thing. And it's in some respects, very repetitive because first you have all the description of how to build it, and then there's the description of how they actually did build it. And then after all of that, Exodus 40, here's how Exodus ends. With this, Exodus 40, verses 33 and 34 says, "So Moses finished the work. He finished all the work of building it. And the cloud covered the tabernacle of meeting, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. Moses was unable to enter the tent of meeting because the cloud rested on it, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. So in the beginning, you had God dwelling in some capacity, in a very intimate way, with his people in the Garden of Eden. And then there was fall, and then there was separation and death. And now God has called his people out of Egypt. They are now a people, and they have a tabernacle. They have a tent of meeting, a place to gather together. And the glory of the Lord filled the temple. And so in a similar way, as God walked with Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, now we have God and his glory dwelling in the temple. And if you want to put this on a timeline, now we can start putting things on a timeline. And so this probably would have been, depending on, scholars disagree, but somewhere between 1400 years BC. Is when the Exodus took place and that temple, that tabernacle was built. And so now God is dwelling in the midst of his people. He has a tent to dwell in a very literal but also figurative sense, just like all the others, and pitching their tents around it. And then we have the years of wandering in the wilderness. 40 some odd years where the Jews wandered around the wilderness until we get to the book of Joshua, and Joshua leading the Israelites into the land. And of course, the whole book of the whole book of Joshua is about the conquest of the land. And so when that's done, the tribes settle in the land. They spread out. Each one has their allotted land, and they start spreading out and setting up and settling in. And so, for a while, they're sort of a confederation of tribes until eventually they say, we want a king. We look around the nations that are around us, and they all have kings. They're all unified. We want a king too. And God, who wanted to be their king, reluctantly says, all right, I'll give you a human king. And so the first king, Saul, and that worked out, But then after that came David. And of course, under King David was the securing of the land and the growth of the borders and just the golden age of Israel. And it was David that says, we still have this tabernacle. We still have this portable tent. We're all living in nice houses. It's all permanent. We need to build a permanent place for God to dwell amongst us. And God said, okay, but you're not going to do it. Your son Solomon will. But David started setting things up. He started collecting the things for the temple and that kind of stuff. But it was Solomon who actually built the temple. And so right around 975 now, so we're 375, 400 years roughly of this tabernacle, and that now they're building a permanent temple in Israel, in Jerusalem. So Solomon built this temple, and it follows the same pattern as the tabernacle, kind of in this shape with the outer courts, and then an inner court where the sacrifice were, and then the Holy of Holies that was the inner portion of it. Actually, it looks something like this. So this is and somewhat speculation, because this temple was destroyed and there's very little archaeology to tell us exactly what it looked like, but it probably looks something like this. Similar to in design to the tabernacle. But then in Chronicles, we have the history of how this was finished and what happened next. And listen, it says, so all the work that Solomon performed for the house of the Lord was finished. And Solomon brought in the things that David his father had dedicated, the silver, the gold, the utensils, and he put the treasures in the house of God. So this is 2 Chronicles, if you ever want to go back and pick that up. But it's the completion and the dedication of the temple. And then the priests priests brought in the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord to its place, into the inner sanctuary of the house, into the Holy of Holies, under the wings of the cherubim. And actually, if you ever watch I'm sure we've all seen Raiders of the Lost Ark, and that's actually a pretty good representation of what the Ark of the Covenant looked like. And so for all these hundreds of years, Israel has guarded this ark, and that thread has gone through the Old Testament as well. And so they bring in the Ark of the Covenant, and then look what happens next. This is 2 Chronicles 5, 13 and 14. There we go. Okay. The temple, see the pattern. The temple, the Lord's temple, was filled with a cloud. And because of the cloud, the priests were not able to continue ministering, for the glory of the Lord filled the temple. So, Eden, God dwelling with his people, with Adam and Eve. And then a tabernacle, a temporary or a portable temple, where the glory of the Lord filled the temple, and God pitched his tent amongst all of his other people, and he dwelt amongst his people. And then the people move into the land, and they build permanent houses and structures. And so they build a more permanent structure for God. And when it's finished and dedicated, his glory dwells amongst the people. God dwelling, building a home amongst his people as well. This theology of temples, this theology of God dwelling and residing, and his glory being amongst his people. That temple stood for roughly 400 years. Just think of that period of how long, that 400 years. Just think of the generation after generation of Jews that went to that temple and worshiped and sacrificed. And that was the center of their dwelling with God. Long about 587 BC, so now we're just a little less than 600 years before Christ, that temple is destroyed. The Persians come in and destroy that temple and raid the treasury and take everything out of it and destroy that temple. And that's when the Jews are taken into exile. And so for 70 years, the Jews are in exile. The Babylonians take over from the Persians, so now they're in exile in Babylon. And they're finally allowed to go back to their land, and that's where we get the books of Ezra and Nehemiah and those where they rebuild the temple. But what's interesting is they rebuild the temple, and there's descriptions of how they rebuilt the temple and what it looked like. And it was built in the same pattern as Solomon's temple, except the glory of the Lord never comes and dwells in that temple. In Ezekiel, there's a verse that describes the glory leaving the temple before it was destroyed, Solomon's temple. But then after the exile and the Jews return and rebuild the temple, there's something different. But the glory of the Lord that has left doesn't return to that temple. So, when did the glory of the Lord return to his people? Pentecost, yeah, we'll get to that. But there's an answer before Pentecost. Come on, what's the answer whenever anybody asks a question in church? Jesus, thank you. Yes. Yeah, let's whenever the question. Jesus, and it's same. Look at these verses out of John chapter 1. These verses that are very familiar. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us. We observed his glory, the glory as the one and only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth. You see the same themes. In fact, we see some of the same words applied to Jesus as was applied first to the first to the tabernacle and to the temple, that God dwelt. In fact, in the Old Testament, written in Hebrew, the verb of tabernacle is to dwell. The noun, it would be a tent. It's the same thing in Greek as John describes Jesus. He dwelt among us. You could actually even say he tabernacled amongst us. And his glory, we beheld his glory. The same two elements. And that's John 1. And I think to make this real clear, John places Jesus' cleansing of the temple in John chapter 2. We see it in Mark. It's much later in Mark, but we see Jesus cleansing the temple. And then immediately after that is Jesus' prediction of destroying the temple but rebuilding it, which really confused them. But of course we know he was referring to his own body. So Jesus ties this all together. First, God dwelling with Adam and Eve in the garden, a temple. And then a tabernacle, a temporary, temporary is not 400 years or so, that's stretching temporary. But it was portable. God tabernacling, templing, dwelling with his people, and then an official brick and mortar temple where God could dwell with his people. And now we see God dwelling with his people in the person of Christ, and we beheld his glory. It's reminiscent of evil. It's reminiscent of Eden. And the glory of God that once indwelt the tabernacle, that once indwelt the temple, came to earth in the person of Christ. Now, our scripture reading this morning was from 1 Corinthians 3, where Paul is writing to the church, of course, in Corinth. And he's using metaphors. Paul's really mixing his metaphors when in 1 Corinthians 3, he talks about I planted, somebody else, Apollos watered, God caused the growth. So we have within Paul talking about the church this metaphor, this agricultural metaphor of growth and planting. But then he also mixes in the metaphor of building, of building a building, where he says, I laid a foundation and others built upon it. And depending on how they built, some building materials are better than other building materials, and when the fires and the judgment come, some will last, others won't. But he mixes these metaphors. But if you remember, it ended, our scripture reading this morning ended with this verse. Don't you yourselves know that you are God's temple, and that the Spirit of God lives in you? If anyone destroys God's temple, God will destroy him. For God's temple is holy, and that is what you are. Now, I don't know, maybe I give the Corinthians a little more, Paul sounds a little exasperated here. Don't you know that you're God's temple? Well, obviously they didn't. And I don't think it was an obvious, well, anyway, we won't get into Paul's personality. But, he's emphasizing to them that you are God's temple. Don't you know? And the you there, don't you know, don't you yourselves know, the you there is plural. Sometimes Paul will refer, actually in Corinthians later, he'll refer to the individual people. You are God's temple. But in this context, the you is plural. So he's talking to the whole church. The church functions in a spiritual and a mystical, it functions in the same way that the temple did, as a dwelling place for the glory of God. Now see, here in Ohio, our English, you can be you, singular. Or it can be you, plural. Now, anybody here from the South? Oh, yeah, there you go. In the South, there is a singular you, and then there's a plural you, y'all. Yeah. Now, I did my master's work in Texas. And in Texas, they have words that we don't have here. and those are two of them. Well, we have you, but they've then got y'all. Another one is fixin'. You know what fixin' means? Yeah, you're fixin' to, right. So after I'm done speaking, Steve can come up and say, we're fixin' to have communion, because that means we're going to do something imminently. Now, probably won't say fixing to, that might be a little too casual, but yeah, that's a word. But the Texans have another. They've got you, which is singular. They have y'all, which is plural. And there's an emphatic inclusive. All y'all, yes, all right. So if I wanted to say, you, stand up, to Steve singularly. If I wanted Steve to stand up, I'd say, you, stand up. If I wanted the row to stand up, I'd say, y'all, stand up. If I want the whole group, I want all y'all to stand up. It's the emphatic plural. Now, okay, I'm pushing grammar here a little bit, but this is what it would look like if Paul was a Texan. Y'all are God's temple, and the Spirit of God lives in y'all. If anyone destroys God's temple, God will destroy him. For God's temple is holy, and that is what all y'all are. You're going to remember this, aren't you? All right. But when you pull the thread of God's dwelling on earth, it starts in Eden with God walking in the garden with Adam and Eve. And then the fall. But then God returns, and his glory indwells the tabernacle, which is pitched as a tent amongst all the tents of his people. And then when they settle the land, a permanent or a physical structure is built for God's glory, for him to dwell amongst the people. But that's destroyed, and the glory leaves. But it returns in the person of Christ. And then at Pentecost, yeah, that glory indwells his people and his church. And that's where we are today. And the great thing is out here in Revelation 22, there's a promise of a new heaven and a new earth, and God dwelling amongst his people. But that's yet to come. Currently, we're here as the church, as God's dwelling place. As the temple of God, we are indwelt by God, both individually and corporately. And if you think about that's a great blessing, but think about the responsibility as well. If God has a dwelling place for his glory in the world today, for people to see his glory, it's in his church and in his people. And as the temple, we experience the presence and the power of God as well. Now, I'll be the first to admit that pulling this thread has been more theological and more historical than actually practical. It's more cognitive, it's more what we believe than how to behave. But in this thread, we see that there's something special about this place. And by this place, I don't mean this specific building. But this building, when it's indwelt by God's people, who are indwelt by God's Spirit, there's something special that happens when indwelt people gather together. And we gather together with God's glory, and we worship. The Psalms talk about God indwelling the worship of his people. But it's not just in this room when we worship. It's downstairs when you're teaching teens how to cook. It's anywhere in this neighborhood, anywhere that the people of God, that this gathering called Wingfoot, this gathering of people where the Spirit of God dwells, anytime we gather together to minister, and ministry is done in the name of Christ, God indwells that, and the world sees it. And there's something special about that.